In 2013, GM announced it would stop building cars in Australia, and 4 years later, the last Holden rolled off the line. They said it was inevitable. Holden was too big, too expensive, too local. Buyers had moved on, labor was costly, the market was small. It all sounded like simple economics. Except it wasn't. Because the truth is, they lied. This video has been brewing in me for years. I've read articles, watched interviews, dug into internal documents, and analyzed financial reports. And once all pieces fit into place, the story that emerged was shocking and completely different from the official line. It is the story GM does not want you to hear. A story where every step of the way, GM fought against Holden, not for it. A story where Holden was consistently profitable, but deliberately made to look like it was not. And a story where killing Holden was not a business decision, but a sacrifice. A deliberate strategy to bleed the Australian icon dry, not because it could not stand, but because it stood in the way. There was nothing Holden could do that could make GM spare it, but let's cut the intro and get into details. A huge thank you to my latest patrons, Oliver T., Laura S., and Carl. And to all my patrons, you guys rock. Your incredible support is what keeps the channel going. I'm aiming to transition to doing this full-time later this year, and joining us on Patreon at the $1 level or above is a fantastic way to help me reach that goal. Now buckle up and get ready, because we are about to discuss the real story of why Holden was disrupted, and I promise you that it won't be boring. Chapter 1. How GM works, bleeding the profitable to prop the failing. Before we dive into Holden, we need to understand how GM operates as a company. Not just its financials, but rather its mindset. In 1990, GM's European arm, Opel, now part of Stellantis, was on top of the world. After years of struggle, they'd become the most profitable car company in Europe, beating even Mercedes and BMW on margins. Here's what the New York Times reported at the time. Intense pride radiates from Robert J. Eaton, president of GM's European operations. Intense fear, too. The pride is easy to understand. At a time when GM's North American operations are approaching crisis proportions, a dramatic revival of the European business, reflected in its hot product line and its strong profits, shows that GM can get something right. The revival also shows that success does not necessarily require vast sums of money. GM's European factories are not nearly as automated as those in America. So we see two things. First, Opel is seeing enormous success, much more than its American operations. And second, they're doing this despite their factories being less automated than the American ones, which, as we'll soon see, is due to lower investment in manufacturing. Saying they were successful is an understatement. Check this out. Though GM sold only 1.5 million cars in Europe last year, versus 3.4 million in the United States, the division earned an estimated $2 billion, or half of GM's estimated total. Most of the rest of the parent company's profit came from non-automotive operations. This explains the intense pride. But what about the fear? One thing that he's fearing is increased competition, and another is that manufacturing costs are not low enough due to the old, underinvested factories. But Eaton's main fear is more telling. As one analyst said, this is where the cash is coming from for investment in GM North America. Indeed, one risk over the next few years is that so much cash will have to go to North America that GM Europe will lose its momentum. In fact, the temptation will be enormous to bleed Europe dry and postpone model programs. That's GM Europe's major worry. And it's not like these worries had no basis. As GM executives acknowledge, Detroit starved the company's European operations in the 1970s. Even in the 1980s, there was a limit to Detroit's generosity. In the 70s under Bob Lutz, GM Europe had enormous success and raked in profits. You'd think GM would protect that golden goose, like any business focused on long-term success would do. But GM operated with a different playbook. They didn't make the required investments and let Opel fall behind. Entering the 80s, the Cadet and the Ascona were considered outdated but still managed to sell well. But as time went by, sales slowed down. And with outdated factories, losses arrived. This wasn't incompetence. It was a calculated strategy of harvesting profitable divisions to prop up failing ones, or to deliver short-term returns to shareholders. Bringing in profits boosts share price, makes the management seem like heroes, and earns them bonuses. And when that subsidiary or division fail, it's their fault, of course. Not Detroit's. GM Europe was in such poor shape in the mid-1980s that GM considered selling or drastically shrinking it. That was when it was generating huge losses, and everything from weak consumer demand for cars to the declining value of the dollar was going against it. Does this remind you of Holden in any way? And like Holden, despite minimal investment, GM Europe did the impossible. The organization came together with a purpose, developed good products that were efficiently built, and started making huge profits again. You'd think this time GM would acknowledge their value and give them some more play, right? Who am I kidding? GM didn't even let Opel and Vauxhall expand to meet the huge demand for their vehicles. Mr. Eaton says he would have liked to have had more production capacity last year, when his division could not satisfy the demand for its cars. A source close to GM said executives in Europe pleaded for more money to expand production, but were turned down by Detroit. Even so, GM Europe managed to thrive. Its market share rose to 11.2% from 10.5% in 1988, the largest increase in the industry, and the company could not come close to meeting the demand for its newest mid-sized car, sold as the Opel Vectra and the Vauxhall Cavalier. Consumers in many countries still have to wait 5 to 6 months for delivery. They're the most profitable of the European car manufacturers. Robert Eaton's greatest fear wasn't the competition. This reveals GM's strategic template in stark detail. When an overseas division becomes profitable, it gets systematically drained to help Detroit and send more money to shareholders. They are not allowed to invest their own profits in updating factories and developing new models, and they can't keep them in a war chest. Instead, they are promised that GM itself will serve as their war chest. The problem is that the keys to this war chest remain in Detroit. It's not mismanagement, it's by design. And it's not the subsidiaries that are failing GM. It's GM that is deliberately failing them. Starved of investments, the division and its cars become outdated, sales slow down, and losses arrive. Investments are badly needed just to become relevant, let alone enjoy the dominance they previously had. But the flow of money is one way only, so GM invests the bare minimum and asks local governments for huge subsidies to keep the operations afloat. Once subsidies are not enough, GM closes shop. I'll go deeper into Opel and Vauxhall in a separate video, so make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon to get notified. Meanwhile, were GM Europe's fears justified? Of course they were. GM took Opel and Vauxhall's profits in the 70s, starved them, and denied them of continued growth. They barely managed to survive the 80s, but they did the impossible and rose back up. And in the 90s, GM took their profits again, and again sent them to decline. But doing the impossible can work only so many times, so this time the decline went on, until GM finally sold them on. With GM working against them, not for them, Opel and Vauxhall never stood a chance. Neither did Holden, but as we will soon see, siphoning out profits and starving the company was just the beginning of GM's fight against them. Holden was a great company with excellent designs. It could have been with us today and even thriving had their owner and strategic partner been anyone but GM. Fast forward to our days for a moment, and with all the talks about tariffs, the market is in a frenzy. Just look at this chart. The Nasdaq has been experiencing wild volatility, plunging down one day and shooting up the next. From the beginning of the year, it dropped over 20%, before recovering slightly to 13%. Bitcoin should have been a hedge against that, but the Bitcoin line is even more volatile, and when the market crashes, so does this hedge. You know what does form a hedge? Gold. While the stock market and Bitcoin swing dramatically and fall, gold has climbed steadily, with gains near 23% year-to-date. This is why Lear Capital, the sponsor of this video, is a smart option for those looking to protect their wealth with physical gold and silver. Did you know that during Trump's previous presidency, gold rose 54% to a record high? If this happens again, that puts gold at almost $4,200 an ounce in Trump's current term. This Bloomberg article from just days ago titled, "Gold is the best place to be with tariff turmoil," says it all. With the uncertainty around tariffs, it isn't just retail buyers. Even central banks are hedging with gold. Lear Capital is an education-first company. There's no pressure to buy, just free information to see if gold is right for you. They have over 27 years of experience, thousands of 5-star reviews, over $3 billion in trusted transactions, and they are the only company with a 24-hour risk-free purchase guarantee. If you change your mind for any reason within 24 hours from the invoice for your purchase, you can get a full refund. Call Lear today at 855-271-1871 or go to trylear.com/ctdots for your free gold and silver wealth protection kit. That's 855-271-1871. And as a special offer, if you make a qualified purchase, Lear Capital will give you up to $15,000 in bonus coins. Call 855-271-1871 or visit trylear.com/ctdots and protect your wealth today. Chapter 2. The Subsidy Game. We've seen GM bleed Opel dry for decades, but did Holden suffer the same fate? Before answering that, let's follow the money trail of taxpayer dollars. From 2001 to 2012, Holden pocketed a staggering $2.17 billion in Australian taxpayer money, roughly $180 million annually. During this same period, their average post-tax profit? A mere $64 million per year. As this new graph simulating results with $180 million knocked off annually, without these handouts, Holden would have been drowning in red ink. If these numbers are real, then it is very clear why once subsidies got cut, GM decided to stop production. The question is, are they real? It should be noted that for GM, these results weren't just convenient, they were the perfect strategy. GM mastered something much easier than competitively building cars, which is extracting government subsidies. Their sweet spot wasn't maximizing profits, but maintaining the illusion of a company perpetually on the brink, just profitable enough to justify a little more help from politicians desperate to save Australian jobs, but never successful enough to stop needing support. Had they shown greater losses, they could have been seen as a bottomless pit, and much higher profits would have made them pay tax and risk losing the coveted subsidies. This happened worldwide, with numerous countries paying up. There's a full video about subsidies in my How GM Sold America series. But for now, let's stick to Australia. With sales ebbing and flowing, how did GM engineer this precarious balance so precisely, year after year? Through two powerful accounting levers that multinational corporations wield with surgical precision: transfer pricing and royalties. 2A. Transfer pricing. When Holden imported parts from other GM divisions, they paid whatever GM headquarters dictated, not market rates. This wasn't just industry speculation. John Crennan, former national marketing manager at Holden and later managing director of Holden Special Vehicles, explicitly confirmed this, saying, "When Holden imported parts from other GM divisions, they didn't pay market rates. The prices were set by GM headquarters." This practice was blatant enough to attract public criticism. In one of my How GM Sold America videos, one of the viewers, David LR2VI, commented with a story: Australian manufacturer ROH Wheels, which made the wheels for previous Commodores, criticized how Holden imported 12,000 wheels from the U.S. at astronomical costs, when ROH and other Australian manufacturers stood ready to supply them at lower cost. News Limited Network reported that the air freight charge alone for the wheels was approximately $833 per vehicle. That's an extraordinary expense for wheels, one that directly slashed Holden's bottom line in Australia, while very probably pumping money back to GM's U.S. operations. The cynical corporate mindset behind these practices was also exposed by legendary auto executive Bob Lutz in his book Car Guys and Bean Counters. When trying to bring the Australian-made Holden Monaro to America as the Pontiac GTO, Lutz encountered the same corporate shell game from the other side. Months passed in arguments over transfer price and who's going to pay for the engineering and the tooling for the U.S. headlights. GM North America's view was, why should we fund an Asia-Pacific project so they can sell in our market? Asia-Pacific's view was, you're the customer and the beneficiary. Why should we pay? Bob Lutz's frustrated response revealed the absurdity. Hello, this is all GM. These are wooden nickels we're pushing back and forth. Toyota wouldn't be having this stupid discussion, since they care about corporate profitability and don't sub-optimize by region. But GM North America is higher up on GM's corporate ladder than their Australian subsidiary. So just like the SSV Redline wheels example, when these conflicts arose, GM North America invariably won. 2B, the royalty racket. Transfer pricing was just half the equation. The other half? Royalties. Holden paid substantial fees to GM headquarters for using global technologies and platforms. But the hypocrisy of this arrangement became apparent when the roles were reversed. The injustice was staggering. The Zeta platform, developed by Holden at a cost of $1 billion Australian dollars, became the foundation for the Chevrolet Camaro, a vehicle that sold hundreds of thousands of units globally. Yet Holden received minimal financial benefit for this world-class engineering achievement. As another of my viewers, a former GM Holden employee called Brian Murphy, 3328, noted, "What really was poor form was that GM gained a vehicle platform and did not pay Holden for its development, which traditionally was on a per-vehicle production basis." And now take a look at this forum post on the Just Commodores forum. As for Holden, profit they made since the mid-70s, and there was a fuck ton of it, especially when you stripped out all the royalties and other GM taxes along the way, was despite GM, not because of it. You are on the right track with exports. I did find it particularly galling that Holden was paying royalties on each and every Zeta car produced back to GM for the use of its IP, even though the program was 100% funded from Holden budget and developed by Holden. Parts were subbed out to other GM engineering studios, but that time resource was invoiced to Holden. If true, this represents the ultimate corporate exploitation. Holden spent $1 billion developing a platform, recorded losses in 2005 and 2006 as a result, received no compensation when GM used it to build 500,000 Camaros, and then had to pay royalties to GM for every Commodore they built on their own platform. Imagine how much better Holden's situation would be if instead of making Holden pay GM for using the Zeta platform, GM would have paid Holden for those Camaros. 2C, following the money. But a viewer commenting on my video and another ranting on a Holden Commodore's forum are not enough to throw accusations. And why did I tell you to imagine Holden's situation when I could have just shown their financials? It's not that easy. The full picture remains deliberately obscured. As journalist Michael West noted in his exposé, Taxpayers Taken on a Long Car Ride, the first thing to notice about Australia's three car makers is how jealously they guard their accounts. But despite this veil of secrecy, some revelations have emerged. For example, in 2013, the Australian Tax Office retroactively disallowed $176 million in deductions for royalties GM Holden paid to GM Global Technologies Operations Corporation in the years 2005 to 2008. This alone is telling. The Tax Authority of Australia found these payments so excessive they refused to recognize them as legitimate business expenses. During these same years, Holden reported a cumulative loss of $367 million. Those disallowed royalties alone would have cut their losses in half, and adding in the royalties that were approved would have very probably pushed these years into the green. The pattern becomes even more suspicious where we have clearer data. In 2010, Holden reported a profit of $112 million after receiving $129 million in subsidies, and in 2011, they reported an $89.7 million profit, identical to that year's subsidies. The mathematical precision is almost comical. These numbers paint a picture where, without subsidies, in 2011, Holden would have barely broken even, and in 2010, they'd have been in the red. But add back the royalties, which we know for these years as $112 million in 2010 and $143 million in 2011, and suddenly Holden would have been profitable even without government assistance. 2D, the perfect scam. This was GM's perfect financial arrangement: extract maximum subsidies from Australian taxpayers while simultaneously draining Holden's genuine profits through accounting maneuvers. Instead of investing in Holden to make it consistently profitable, GM underinvested and then lowered bookkeeping results some more, maintaining the company in precisely the right state of apparent distress to justify continued government support. The truth becomes inescapable. Had GM not used transfer pricing and skewed royalties, Holden would likely have been profitable even without government subsidies. The company that gave Australia iconic vehicles like the Commodore and the Ute wasn't killed by market forces or inefficiency. It was methodically drained by its parent company, then discarded when it no longer served GM's global ambitions. But if Holden was profitable, even without subsidies, why did GM get rid of it once subsidies were gone? That's by no fault of Holden. Holden was profitable, but not wildly so, and GM didn't want to bother with readying it for future challenges when they had bigger goals in mind. Goals, or rather agreements, for which GM was willing to divest not only of Holden, but also of everything else, including their soul. We'll discuss this further in Chapter 4, but first let's examine what this systematic financial draining did to the once proud Australian icon. Chapter 3. Starved of investment, then blamed for failing. From the mid-80s through 2004, Holden was consistently profitable for GM. Even as consumer preferences shifted towards smaller cars and competition intensified, the company remained financially viable. You'd think a profitable company would invest in manufacturing and future models to retain its leadership or even relevance. But what happened next followed the exact playbook we saw with Opel, a systematic pattern of selective investment that ultimately compromised Holden's ability to compete. While money was systematically siphoned out through royalties and transfer pricing as we've shown in Chapter 2, GM's approach to investing in Holden was bizarre. Massive injections of cash followed by years of neglect. But while I came to this video certain that GM left Holden ancient, research showed this wasn't fully correct. In fact, in 2006, GM invested over $1 billion in redesigning the Elizabeth plant for production of the Zeta platform and VF Commodore. This wasn't pocket change. It represented a genuine commitment to making Holden the center of GM's global large car strategy. As one of my viewers, Jim Graham 6722, who is supposedly the great-great-grandson of Henry James Holden, told me, the GM factories included some of the most advanced vehicle production robots anywhere, able to manufacture several different models on the one line. This sophisticated technology was impressive, demonstrating that when GM wanted to invest, they could do so at a world-class level. But here's the twist. It wasn't GM investing the money. It's just that GM finally allowed Holden to invest their own hard-earned profits in building their future, rather than siphoning the funds away like they typically did. Here's the critical point. This substantial investment was laser-focused on large car production, specifically the Zeta platform, which GM wanted to go global. Meanwhile, other aspects of Holden's manufacturing capabilities remained outdated. When the Elizabeth plant finally began producing smaller cars like the Cruze in 2011, it was doing so with an uneven technological foundation, cutting edge in some areas, outdated in others, and anyway, that was too little, too late, as 2 years later GM would announce their plans to close shop. This technology gap created serious problems. In areas where production wasn't modernized, manufacturing remained labor-intensive, a critical disadvantage in Australia, where labor costs were substantially higher than in Asia. Academic analysis confirmed that Australian automotive plants, including Holden's, were characterized by outdated production technologies in many areas despite pockets of advanced automation. More troubling was the production volume issue. The Elizabeth plant needed to produce 250,000 units annually to be efficient by global standards. Instead, it hovered around 160,000, guaranteeing higher per-unit costs and making it impossible to compete with imports. As then Industry Minister Kim Carr noted in 2013, significant parts of Holden's manufacturing infrastructure had not received the updates needed to keep pace with global competition. The evidence was in the product timeline itself. After the massive investment in the VF Commodore that launched in 2006, subsequent updates became fewer and farther between. By the 2010s, Holden had the perfect factory for producing large cars few people wanted, while lacking the capability to efficiently build the smaller cars consumers actually demanded. The irony is painful. GM did let Holden make significant investments, but what they didn't let Holden do was decide what to invest in. Since investment decisions came from across the ocean, they were far removed from what Holden needed and wanted, and ill-fitting for the market. And when the global large car strategy centered on the Zeta platform failed to materialize as planned, Holden was left with world-class capabilities to produce vehicles that fewer people wanted, and outdated capabilities for producing the vehicles that might have saved them. This wasn't simple starvation. It was force-feeding Holden the wrong diet. Holden was starving and needed an oven to bake bread, but headquarters only let them buy the machinery to make expensive cakes. As Mike Devereaux, Holden's managing director, admitted in a 2013 interview, maintaining competitiveness would have required hundreds of millions in new investment that wasn't forthcoming, because GM was unwilling to make the sustained, comprehensive investments needed to keep Holden competitive across its entire production range. But why wasn't it willing? The answer, in the next chapter, is weird and infuriating. Chapter 4. Enter China, the post-bailout pivot. So why didn't GM let Holden invest their own profits in other models and production lines? The answer changed with time. Before the bailout, GM's reasoning followed a certain corporate logic. Their regional-focused strategy assigned small to medium cars to Korea, where labor is cheaper, and large cars and utes to Holden, which excelled at building them. Was this smart? Maybe. We can debate this all day, but at least there was an operational strategy behind it. But after the bailout, everything changed. Let me tell you a story. There's a guy I know who for many years has been happily married to a wonderful wife. Their relationship has weathered ups and downs but remained solid and loving. Then one day he met a younger woman, and they had an affair. Initially it was casual, call it convenience or maybe opportunity. But then two things happened. First, the new woman leveraged information that could have destroyed him and demanded exclusivity. Either he leaves his wife or he's done. And second, and perhaps more significantly, he fell madly in love with her, all starry-eyed. From this moment on, it didn't matter how wonderful his wife had been. It didn't matter how she stood for him through thick and thin and helped him when he was down. Even worse, there was nothing she could do or change in herself to make him change his mind. Whether from fear or infatuation, he abandoned his marriage and moved in with his mistress. And this is exactly what happened with GM. GM's loyal wife was Holden, Opel, Vauxhall, and almost every one of GM's other international operations. The seductive mistress was SAIC, GM's joint venture partner in China. They did what was good for them. It is not them I am ranting about. Following the 2008 financial crisis when GM was on the brink of collapse, GM was bailed out by American taxpayers. However, that bailout was limited for saving its American operations alone. In an attempt to keep debt-ridden GM Korea afloat, GM asked SAIC to help it secure crucial loans from Chinese banks. In return, SAIC became the dominant partner in their joint venture, and with newfound leverage, SAIC demanded something extraordinary: effective exclusivity in developing and manufacturing GM's future global vehicles. GM agreed. Whether driven by fear of losing the vast Chinese market or enchanted by the money-for-nothing promise of selling Chinese cars worldwide, GM signed agreements with SAIC to make China their primary global development and production hub. These weren't just operational adjustments. They were strategic pivots that would systematically dismantle GM's global footprint outside North America. The impact was immediate and devastating for GM's international subsidiaries. Holden, kept alive until Australian subsidies ran dry, then ruthlessly shuttered. Opel and Vauxhall, maintained until European incentives disappeared, then sold off. GM Vietnam, factories sold to VinFast. GM Thailand, operations completely closed. GM Korea, starved of development resources, forced to build vehicles on aging platforms. This wasn't about Holden's performance, the exchange rate, or Australia's economic conditions. This wasn't about the market for large cars compared to small. It was about GM's commitment to building their future around SAIC and China. Every public statement that GM made, blaming market conditions, manufacturing costs, or even the government, was pure gaslighting. Corporate theater designed to mask a global decision made at the highest levels. The cold truth is that Holden could have doubled its efficiency, halved its costs, and tripled its sales, and GM still wouldn't have let it develop new platforms. They just let Holden carry on longer until their platforms run out, and then shut it down. Because letting Holden build new platforms would have contradicted GM's new Chinese strategy and would be breaking their promise to their powerful mistress, or rather, their master. For the full story on GM's Chinese pivot, check out my How GM Sold America series, link in the description. But the bottom line remains. Holden's fate was sealed not by market forces or management mistakes, but by boardroom deals made thousands of miles away in Detroit and Shanghai. Chapter 5. Digging Holden's Grave with Holden's Money. Let's start with China. If you thought GM's affair with China was bad enough, what I'm about to tell you is even more shocking. GM didn't just abandon Holden for SAIC, they forced Holden to train its replacement and pay for its own execution. Let's start with the end and go back in time. According to Jim Graham 6722, who assumedly is the great-great-grandson of Henry James Holden himself, the GM factories included some of the most advanced vehicle production robots anywhere, able to manufacture several different models on one line. Along with the design shop, the factories were closed, packed up, and moved to Shanghai. All the supporting engines, transmissions, and sundry components have also gone. I expect most of this stuff wound up with SAIC as well. Think about that for a moment. The The very technology that Australian taxpayers helped fund through subsidies, cutting-edge manufacturing equipment that could have saved Holden, was physically dismantled and shipped off to China. Not just designs or intellectual property, but the actual machines themselves. But long before they were shipping physical assets to China, GM was sending something even more valuable: Holden's engineering expertise. Holden engineers, some of the best automotive minds in the Southern Hemisphere, were dispatched to train SAIC GM's Chinese engineers. The same brilliant team that later developed the billion-dollar Zeta platform was busy teaching their Chinese counterparts how to replace them. Australian know-how, paid for with Australian dollars, handed over to build GM's Chinese future. The pattern of exploitation went even deeper. In 2005, Holden began exporting the Australian-built WL Holden Caprice to China as the Buick Royale. The following year, there were plans announced for Holdens to be sold in the booming Chinese market. This could have been a lifeline for Holden's manufacturing, access to the world's fastest-growing auto market. There are several versions on what happened next, but what everyone agrees on is that from 2007 to 2012, SAIC GM built the Buick Park Avenue in China based on the WM Holden Caprice, with Holden engineers tutoring them on how it's done. From here, it gets blurry, with reports ranging from SAIC GM just assembling the cars from Australian-made CDK kits to this being a full Chinese build. Whichever way it was, the bottom line is that Holden engineers were assigned to teach their Chinese counterparts how to take their jobs, and that even if Holden did profit from selling kits, such sales were short-lived. Mind you, this wasn't even the first time GM made Holden build its own replacement. Remember GM's regional focus strategy that assigned small to medium cars to Korea? The strategy that left Holden unable to produce the smaller cars that consumers increasingly wanted? Well, guess who paid for GM to acquire Daewoo, the company that became GM Korea? Holden did, for over $650 million US. In 2002, Holden paid $251 million US for a 42.1% stake in Daewoo and shouldered Daewoo's debts. By 2005, Holden's holdings had increased to over 50%. It was one of the largest foreign investments ever made by an Australian company. Holden then began selling in Australia low-quality Daewoos, rebadged as Holdens. While this provided Daewoo with a financial lifeline, these initial vehicles, which even GM executives privately admitted were substandard, severely damaged Holden's hard-earned reputation for quality and reliability among Australian consumers. As Toby Hagon wrote in his article, the demise of Holden began decades ago, and General Motors carries much of the blame. From a brand that hit the bullseye more often than not, suddenly Holden was selling many imported cars that did not live up to the Holden brand. Sales were initially unaffected. The lag effect in the car industry and the power of the brand meant buyers trusted Holden to deliver. But drivers soon realized that some of the new Holdens, Captiva, Viva, and Epica, to name a few, were not what they expected. Formerly rusted-on Holden drivers were gradually doing the unthinkable and buying Toyotas, Mazdas, and Hyundais. Holden went from being a dominant number one to thrashing it out with imported brands. And if that's not enough, just as they would later do with China, Holden engineers were sent to train Daewoo's engineers, teaching them how to design, build, and test quality cars. Holden invested hundreds of millions more and continued carrying Daewoo's debt. And once GM Korea was established and stabilized, what happened to Holden's substantial investment? Instead of letting Holden profit from Korean sales, GM simply took Holden's shares in GM Korea off their hands, absorbing the now valuable asset back into the parent company after Holden had done all the heavy lifting and taken all the financial risk. The cruel irony is breathtaking. One of the primary reasons GM cited for Holden's eventual demise was its inability to compete in smaller car segments. Yet GM had deliberately 1. Denied Holden from investing accrued profits back in manufacturing. 2. Made Holden use that money to pay for the acquisition of Daewoo, covering its debt and transforming it into a modern GM Korea. 3. Assigned Holden engineers to raise a viable GM Korea from the ashes of Daewoo. 4. Forced Holden to sell early Daewoos rebadged as Holdens, which severely damaged Holden's reputation with buyers. 5. Assigned all small car production to Korea and prohibited Holden from making its own small cars. 6. And once GM Korea was primed and profitable, took Holden's shares in it away from them. GM didn't just neglect Holden. They extracted its money, expertise, and technology to build their operations elsewhere, and then blamed Holden for the very weaknesses GM had engineered. They made Holden dig its own grave, pay for the shovel, and train the firing squad. And all this, the investment in Daewoo, the training of Chinese and Korean engineers, the lost export opportunities to China, was happening at the same time GM was claiming that Holden required government subsidies just to stay afloat. Money that could have been invested in modernizing Holden's production facilities or developing new models was instead diverted to build GM's future in Asia, a future that had no place for Australia. This wasn't mere corporate neglect. It was a calculated strategy to extract maximum value from Holden while setting up the operations that would eventually replace it. As the saying goes, GM buys it, bleeds it, buries it. In loving memory of Holden, Opel, Vauxhall, and Saab, my God, there should be a law preventing GM from owning other companies. Chapter 6, the SUV that could have saved them. By 2005, Holden had been methodically hogtied by GM at every turn. Let's take stock of just how thoroughly GM had restricted their Australian subsidiary. First, GM extracted Holden's profits through manipulated transfer pricing and one-sided royalty schemes, leaving them barely profitable despite strong operations. Second, while demanding royalties from Holden, GM refused to similarly pay royalties to Holden when using Australian-developed IP in other vehicles. Third, GM blocked Holden from investing in its own future, even with what little capital remained after GM's financial engineering. Fourth, GM forced Holden to use its limited resources to purchase and develop Daewoo, training the very engineers who would later replace them. Fifth, they also had Holden's engineers teach and train SAIC GM, again training the very engineers who would later replace them. Sixth, GM's regional-focused strategy explicitly prohibited Holden from producing small and medium-sized cars, restricting them to the large car segment only, right as global consumer preferences were shifting away from large sedans. Seventh, when Holden did develop world-class technology and designs, GM ensured the fruits of those innovations flowed primarily to other GM divisions, while Holden received minimal benefit. It's hard to imagine a more comprehensive strategy to prevent a company from adapting and surviving. Holden was operating with both hands tied behind its back, blindfolded, and standing on a trapdoor that GM could release at any moment, and yet, remarkably, Holden fought on. Despite these crippling restrictions, they refused to surrender. As the global automotive market underwent its seismic shift away from sedans toward SUVs in the mid-2000s, Holden's flagship Commodore was watching its sales numbers fall year after year. But Holden's engineers had identified a lifeline, a potential path to success despite all of GM's restrictions. Their solution? A Zeta-based SUV. This wasn't some desperate Hail Mary pass. It was a strategically brilliant plan built on three pillars. First, it would capture buyers abandoning the sedan segment. The same loyal Holden customers who loved their Commodores but needed more versatility would have a natural upgrade path within the brand. Second, it would dramatically increase factory utilization at Elizabeth. By building both Commodores and SUVs on the same Zeta platform, production volume would rise, spreading fixed costs across more vehicles and reducing the per-unit manufacturing expense that GM constantly complained about. Third, and perhaps most importantly, it would generate significantly higher margins. SUVs commanded premium prices compared to sedans, potentially transforming Holden's financial picture almost overnight. As former Holden Advanced Vehicle Design Chief Mark Sheridan revealed, the locally developed Holden SUV could have saved local car manufacturing in Australia. There was an SUV, and that was probably one of the defining moments around global Zeta, and it was probably one of the defining moments around Holden's success in Australia. The plan was sound, the expertise was there, the market demand was clear. Ford Australia had already proven the concept with their Territory SUV, which had become a sales success despite being built on an aging platform. Holden's Zeta-based SUV would have been even more compelling, with rear and all-wheel drive capabilities, designed by talented Holden designer Andrei Koromhaz and built on the Zeta platform, which was new and world-beating. But GM leadership killed it. Ford made a really good decision around Territory. We looked at cars exactly like that way back on the Zeta platform, and the GM leadership at the time said no. GM's top brass from America said, "We can do these better and more efficiently because they are the types of cars we do, off North American architectures rather than the Zeta architecture." Let that sink in. GM executives believed they could build better SUVs based on North American platforms. The same executives who had earlier hailed the Zeta platform as the cornerstone of GM's global large vehicle strategy. The same Zeta platform they had invested over $1 billion to develop in Australia. To placate Holden, GM promised to provide similar imported SUVs from elsewhere in their global lineup. But even this consolation prize failed to materialize in any meaningful way. The vehicles that eventually arrived were either too expensive, too late to market, or simply not competitive with rivals already established in Australia. The SUV that never was represents perhaps the clearest example of how GM's decisions actively undermined Holden's survival. I have no idea whether GM blocked it due to their agreements with SAIC in China, or it was just stubborn elbowing by GM USA without weighing in the implications for Australia. In either case, the bottom line is that Holden is dead. Think about the bitter irony. GM consistently claimed Holden couldn't survive because of high production costs and changing consumer preferences. Yet when Holden developed a strategy to address both issues simultaneously, reducing costs through higher volume and meeting shifting consumer demand with an SUV, GM blocked it. This wasn't just a missed opportunity. For Holden, it was the difference between life and death. The SUV could have transformed the company's fortunes. Instead, GM sentenced Holden to manufacture only a type of vehicle, large sedans, that they knew was facing declining demand worldwide. They restricted Holden from the small car market by assigning small cars to GM Korea, and when Holden found a way forward with SUVs, they blocked that path too. The Zeta SUV wasn't just a vehicle that never made it to production. It was Holden's last best hope, systematically crushed by the very company that was supposed to be its steward. And what about Andrei Koromas, the talented Holden designer behind the rejected SUV? His career path tells the whole story. Checking his LinkedIn page, we see that he started off at Ford, then moved to Holden where he did advanced work on a Cadillac Holden SUV and Sport-Wagon. Imagine that beast for a moment. I'd buy one in a heartbeat. And after working on the SUV that could have saved Holden, he was reassigned, first to GM Korea, then to PATAC, the Pan-Asia Technical Automotive Center, where GM trained SAIC GM engineers and designed their next generation of cars. Then he spent 4 years in SAIC GM. Theoretically, Andrei's leaving Ford to help Holden may have hurt Ford, and his leaving Holden to help GM Korea and SAIC GM definitely helped bring Holden's mortal wounds. But there is a huge difference. While leaving Ford was Andrei's own voluntary choice, it was Holden's parent company, its custodian, that sent him to help deliver the mortal blows. Holden's best talent was exported to Korea and later China, unknowingly transferring their expertise to the very operations that would later replace them. As we previously said, GM made Holden dig its own grave. Chapter 7. A platform with nowhere to go. GM had hogtied Holden in multiple ways, forcing them to focus exclusively on large sedans and utes built on a single platform, even as that market segment was shrinking worldwide. But the Zeta platform was genuinely world-class engineering. Surely Holden could at least export these excellent vehicles to offset declining domestic sales, right? Unfortunately, no. GM's regional strategy effectively trapped Holden on an island with a brilliant product they weren't allowed to sell globally. As Bob Lutz reveals in his book, Car Guys vs. Bean Counters, when he first joined GM, he was amazed by Holden's Commodore SS. Reading a glowing review in Car and Driver, he was struck by the magazine's subtitle, "The good news, it's the best GM car ever. The bad news, you can't buy it." Lutz immediately saw an opportunity. Why wouldn't GM do the relatively modest amount of engineering change to make the car legal for the United States, import it as a Pontiac or Buick, and finally give the American performance car enthusiast the product that nobody believed GM was capable of building anymore? But when he suggested this at GM, he encountered fierce resistance. As Lutz explains, the reasons not to do this came pouring in, mostly revolving around the fact that it wasn't our car. It belonged to GM Asia Pacific. This reveals the dysfunctional core of GM's regional model. Rather than operating as one global company seeking the best outcome for shareholders, GM had become a collection of fiefdoms jealously guarding their territories and budgets. The North American division was so protective of their market that they even presented Lutz with a heavily modified Pontiac Grand Prix, converted from front-wheel drive to rear-wheel drive and fitted with a V8 engine. If this is really what you want, why deal with Asia Pacific, We can do exactly the same thing, right here in North America, they insisted. Let's recognize this approach was financially absurd. Changing a car that much really meant an all-new car, and at the anticipated modest sales volume, would never make business sense. After months of arguments over transfer price and questions like who's going to pay for the engineering and the tooling for the U.S. headlights, Lutz's exasperation reveals the absurdity of GM's internal politics. Hello, this is all GM. These are wooden nickels we're pushing back and forth. Toyota wouldn't be having this stupid discussion since they care about corporate profitability and don't sub-optimize by region. When the Holden-based Pontiac GTO finally reached America, the long delays had aged the design, and currency fluctuations had pushed the price from the target of $25,000 to over $30,000, ensuring lukewarm market acceptance. The tragic irony was profound. Holden had developed one of the best rear-wheel drive architectures in the world, but GM's internal politics and regional focus meant they couldn't fully capitalize on it. They weren't allowed to produce small cars. They were blocked from developing an SUV. And even when they created a world-beating large car platform, they were severely limited in their ability to export it or receive fair compensation when others used it. Chapter 8. Killed from Within. Holden was trapped on an island with a great product that GM wouldn't allow them to sell to the world. And when GM did allow limited exports, they ensured the financial benefits flowed primarily to Detroit rather than back to Australia. This wasn't just bad business, it was corporate cannibalism. Holden had demonstrated they could create world-class vehicles despite limited resources. But instead of rewarding this excellence with expanded opportunities, GM effectively punished it by restricting Holden's ability to grow while simultaneously extracting the value of their innovations for use elsewhere. By the 2010s, the writing was on the wall. With a platform that couldn't go anywhere and a parent company increasingly focused on China and actively fighting Holden, Holden's fate was sealed. Not by market forces or their own performance, but by strategic decisions made thousands of miles away in boardrooms where Holden had no voice. Let's take a final account of how thoroughly GM undermined Holden. They blocked Holden from producing small cars, assigning that entire segment to Korea. They prevented Holden from developing an SUV when the market clearly demanded it. They restricted Holden's export opportunities, even for the world-class vehicles they did produce. They denied Holden the royalties they deserved when their innovations were used elsewhere in GM. They siphoned away profits through manipulated transfer pricing and one-sided royalty schemes. They forced Holden to invest in Daewoo, then took back the stake once it became valuable. They made Holden train their own replacements in Korea and China. They shipped Holden's factory equipment to Shanghai after the closure. And when Australian subsidies finally ran dry, they shut everything down. This wasn't a company that failed. This was a company that was sacrificed. No one understood this bitter truth better than Peter Hahnenberger, the former Holden chairman who led the company during its golden era in the late 1990s and early 2000s. In his final public comments about Holden's demise, his pain was palpable. It's not my General Motors anymore. It is very short-sighted. What we had strategically placed didn't come true, and made this company ultimately die. Hahnenberger wasn't describing a business failure. He was describing a betrayal, the strategic vision he and other Holden leaders had created of a thriving, innovative Australian car company deeply integrated with GM's global operations was systematically dismantled, not because it was flawed, but because it no longer aligned with GM's pivot to China. This wasn't first-degree murder. It was something worse. GM killed Holden through indifference. Enamored with their Chinese affair, they simply stopped caring about what happened to their loyal Australian partner of over 70 years. In fact, they thought Holden stood in their way. Perhaps the most poignant perspective comes from John Crennan, former national marketing manager of Holden and managing director of both Holden Special Vehicles and the Holden Racing Team. Like Hahnenberger, Crennan too said that Holden was not the company that he once knew. Crenno's family's connection to Holden spanned generations. While appearing at the Senate inquiry into GM's withdrawal from the Australian market, he closed his testimony with the following words. My father's hero at GMH was Mr. Joe Dillion, the head of sales in the 50s. He was a formidable executive renowned throughout every GMH corner in Australia for his career-long motto on all dealer communications and sales conferences of "Fight one more round," a renowned rallying call to all dealers and staff. I only wish GM in Detroit had read Mr. Dillion's bulletin prior to their decision and instead allocated their $1 billion close-down budget to fight one more round. But GM never gave Holden that final round. They never gave them a fighting chance. Obligated to China and blinded by short-term thinking, GM did not want Holden to win, regardless of how brilliant their engineering, how dedicated their workforce, or how loyal their customers. And so, an iconic Australian company with over a century of history was reduced to an import badge and finally to nothing at all. What do you think of all this? Was Holden's demise inevitable, or was it engineered by GM? And if GM engineered it, was it justified because why not build everything in China? Or was it a slap in the face to Australian taxpayers for all the subsidies GM smooched despite Holden being profitable? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this video interesting, please like and subscribe to help the channel grow, and make sure to hit the bell icon to get notified once I drop the Opel and Vauxhall video. A huge thank you to my latest patrons, Oliver T., Laura S., and Carl. And to all my patrons, you guys rock, and I have something to ask from you. Later this year, I plan to take the leap and start making videos full-time, so if you want to help me do so, consider supporting me on Patreon for as little as $1 a month. To get educated on alternative investments like gold and silver, call this video's sponsor, Lear Capital, today at 855-271-11871 or go to trylear.com/ctdots and get your free gold and silver wealth protection kit. You can find me on X at x.com/connectingodots. Until next time, I am connecting the dots and you are amazing.